Hello and welcome everybody to the Publishers Panel this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We're so happy to have you here, and we currently have 159, 160, the numbers just keep going up, attendees with us today in the audience. So hello everybody, wherever you are. I'm Sawad Hussain. I'm a translator from Arabic to English, and I'm delighted to have with me here today publishers and editors from a number of houses where we're going to get to hear more about their thought process and really get an insider look into how things work. I'd like to welcome Eric from Dedalus Books, Sylvina from Ugly Duckling Presse, and Nafor from Bakwa Books, and Kirsten from Pushkin Presse. The way that this panel will work is that we're going to invite each of our panelists to share a bit about their houses and how translation fits into the profile of their house for about 4 to 5 minutes. And after that, we're going to have a roundtable conversation about their expectations of translators, how they acquire new titles, advice for translators when pitching and submitting manuscripts. That will take us to about 2:20. So in just under an hour, we will then have a good meaty 25 minutes for Q&A. I know a number of you have some burning questions. So please make sure to put them into the Q&A, which should be towards the bottom of your screen. And then you can also upvote any questions that you would like me to ask as a priority, and I will be making sure to ask those ones first. So let's get started. Can we start with Sylvina, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sawad, for the introduction. My name is Sylvina Lopez Medin. I'm talking from New York. I'm an editor and the rights manager at Ugly Duckling Presse, which is UDP for short. UDP is a non-profit publisher for poetry, translation, experimental nonfiction, performance texts, and books by artists based in Brooklyn, New York. UDP favors emerging, international, and forgotten writers, and its books, chapbooks, and artist books, broadsides, and periodicals often contain handmade elements, like letterpress covers, for instance.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm a member of the editorial collective. We are 9 editors in the editorial collective, and I'm also a member of the editorial board of Señal, which is the Latin American series we have for contemporary Latin American poets. So translation, you asked before about the role of translation in our press is really very, very important. And an example of that is the Latin American series, which is quite unusual to find, at least in the US, where only 3% of the published books are books in translation. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, Sylvina, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that Latin American series as we progress. Eric.
Hi.
Hi.
We've been going for 40 years, next year 40 years, which seems quite amazing. We started in 1983 with 3 first novels. A few months later, we did our first translations, the DH launched translations of Giovanni Verga. And I commissioned a new translation of The House by the Medlar Tree by Giovanni Verga. My only ambition as a publisher was to publish The House by the Medlar Tree. So in 1985, I achieved all my ambitions as a publisher. I really should have stopped there when I was winning, but we're still here. We're committed to original English language fiction, but primarily translation. As we've gone on, we've become better known for our translations than for anything else. European Classics list started in 1984, Contemporary European Translation in 1992. Our focus mainly was Europe, partly political, because we believed that the UK was part of Europe and part of the European publishing world and not an adjunct of the sort of British-American publishing scene. And so for us, it was fundamentally important to translate from Europe. in 2010, we went outside Europe and began an Africa list, Dedalus Africa. And in 2020, we started Young Dedalus, which at the moment is purely a translation list they might develop. And next year, you mentioned Latin America, we're going to start Dedalus Latin America as well. We're spreading out from Europe because of Brexit. We're fundamentally committed to translation, especially from Europe, but we believe that translation enriches the reader. And for me personally, how do you choose a book? Well, most of our books have been chosen for us by translators. So I look on my list, I can't find many titles that I personally have chosen. I can find about 10. We've done about 300. So it's really important, external people. And we have 4 translators on our board. So translation is fundamental to us.
Yeah, wow. I'm really intrigued to hear how you're branching out more and more as the years go on. But I'm especially happy to hear you have a Young Dedalus list. I'm not sure if everybody caught that, but yes, specifically YA in translation. So everybody should definitely think about Dedalus books if you have some YA in translation that you would like to pitch. Moving on to Nafor, yes.
Hey, hello everyone, for Edwin from Cameroon. So I'm here for Bakwa Books. And Bakwa Books is a Cameroon-based non-profit independent publisher of literary fiction, creative fiction, and translation. So it was born from the desire to replicate Bakwa Magazine's vision, as well as the absence of innovative local publishing channels in Cameroon. So,
sorry, Nafor, I'm going to ask if you can just speak up just a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying I'm here for Bakwa Books, which is a Cameroon-based non-profit independent publisher of literary fiction, creative fiction, and translation. So it was born from the desire to replicate Bakwa Magazine's vision, as well as the absence of innovative local publishing channels in Cameroon. So Cameroon being a bilingual country, officially bilingual country, English and French, translation is very, very central to the work we do. And we started out as a magazine publishing in English. And over the time, we discovered that we needed to cater to both audiences, the French speaking and English speaking, and which is where translation came into, became a core part of our work. So we are currently going to publish one of the most important books to be published in Cameroon in the last decade. And probably we'll talk more about that later. So translation is very central to the work we do as a publisher.
Right, wonderful, thank you. Yes, Kirsten.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirsten. I'm an assistant editor at Pushkin Presse, based in London. So Pushkin Presse has been going for 25 years now. We're a UK publisher, an independent publisher, and part of the Independent Alliance in the UK. We have 4 lists: the Pushkin Presse list, which is mainly contemporary and classic fiction and non-fiction in translation. Our One list, which is a sort of smaller but very vibrant, very exciting list of English language originals. Our Pushkin Vertigo list, which covers all of our crime publishing and which is a mix of English language originals and works in translation. And Pushkin Children Books, our children and YA list, which again is a mix of English language originals and translation. So we began as a predominantly European classics list for quite a few years. When we were founded, we were probably best known for publishing Stefan Zweig, the Austrian classic author. But since around 2012, where the current MD, Adam Freudenheim, took over, we've grown massively, and we now publish a huge range of titles, about roughly 80 every year now, from all over the world, from 25 languages at our last count. Some recent successes that we've had, or recent kind of notable books that might help give a flavor of our kind of publishing, is a book called The Passenger by Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz, which was translated by Philip Boehm, which was a rediscovered classic about a German Jewish man fleeing from the authorities on the night of Kristallnacht. When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatou, translated by, Nathan, by Nathaniel West, which is a sort of creative hybrid of fiction and non-fiction, exploring the sort of the creative geniuses in science in the last 100 years or so. Tender is the Flesh, which is an Argentinian dystopia by Agustina Basterrica, translated by Sarah Moses, which is a book about a near future in which eating human meat has become legal. And we've become also very known for publishing Japanese crime fiction in recent years, an example of which would be the great Saishi Yokomizo, kind of a great post-World War II Japanese classic crime writer. We're a small team, we're only 14 people, and there's 5 editors and 2 assistant editors, so sort of 7 people, all acquiring at different rates. But yeah, that's Pushkin.
Wow, thank you. I don't know why I thought your team was so much bigger, just because Pushkin is putting out so much.
And some of the team's part-time as well, so it's small but mighty.
Well, indeed, yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to get now into, which I think is a sort of selfish question, but one that I expect many other translators have as well, which is, how do you hear about the books that you end up acquiring, but also more importantly, like what makes you say yes? Is it, because the author is high profile, or perhaps the book touches upon some, hot topics, like right now, women's reproductive rights is, something that's like a hot topic. But I guess I just wanted to hear more about, how do you go about acquiring books? If there's anything you're able to share with us as a new title that you're excited about, that you've recently acquired, and what makes you go like, yes, we need this book? Maybe we can start with Silvina.
Yes. So usually we have an annual open call, usually in the summer, and it's also one of the challenges because we receive many submissions, even though Ugly Duckling Press works with very specific types of books, especially poetry. Last time we received around 700 submissions.
Wow.
And all of them are usually read by at least 2 editors, so it's a huge process. And I think our name Ugly Duckling has to do with one of the aspects we take into account when choosing books, which usually aren't high profile books or books that would be one of the aspects we take into account is being books that would otherwise be a challenge to be published with other presses. So that's why the name Ugly Duckling. And yes, books that are usually tend to be more experimental, poetry, and translation, as I said before, is very important for us. So then we read, we vote among the editorial team, and we end up deciding around at the most 20 titles from those 700.
Wow.
So it's very hard. It's very hard because we usually get very good things, and it's hard to decide.
Right. Do you ever seem to get submissions that might be quite similar, and so you're ending up having to choose between 2 very similar projects and just weighing up which one you think would be, a better fit? Or do you tend to find the submissions, I know there's 700 of them, but still that they each are unique in their, in what they're bringing to the table?
We take into account all that. We end up doing several rounds, and in the end we end up, with 40 titles, for instance, and we have to reduce to around 20, and we take into account the balance among those titles.
Right.
Like translation, gender, many aspects we take into account for the final decision.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Nafor, do you want to share with us how Bakwa Books finds out about their books and what makes it a book for Bakwa?
I guess Bakwa gets its titles from basically everywhere, actually. So our titles usually come to us through conversations with peers, through hearsay, sometimes through pitches from editors, other editors, pitches from writers themselves and from agents. So yes, that's it. And from everywhere, basically. But what makes the books that we finally get to publish are generally, I think I can say we are more or less a niche kind of a publisher, because we are focusing on trying, there's a lot to be done locally in terms of publishing. There's a lot of people that needs to be heard, and a lot of people that have been published before but haven't been translated locally. And that's more or less our primary focus. So the books have to stand out, of course. Yeah, we like experimental books. We like stuff that leaves you thinking after you're done reading it. And last year, we acquired Hemle Boom. Hemle Boom is basically one of the most important writers in Cameroon right now. She's based in France. Okay. And she was published by Pierre Astier in French. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we acquired the rights last year, and we are publishing her in English this year. And interestingly, which is I think a unique circumstance, for the first time, I think, in Cameroon, we have a book written by a Cameroonian, translated by a Cameroonian, and the American and UK versions will be based on the translation done by a Cameroonian. So for the first time, I think the translation is coming from the continent towards the rest of the world.
Yes, I'm loving this. Okay, this is so great. You have to, I mean, when is it out? When is it out?
Our publication date is a joint publication date with Two Lines Press in the US.
Okay.
So it's out in September of this year.
In September.
Yes.
Okay.
And we also acquired Walking on Cowrie Shells, which is a collection of short stories by a Cameroonian, Nana Kweti. Mm-hmm. And in the same vein, we are working on the translation of a story from that same collection, forthcoming Pan-African project around translation. Okay. We also have an untitled debut novel, which revolves around how a secret destroys a family in Limbe in Cameroon. And we have an experimental poetry translation book, which is being led by Dr. Georgina Collins from the UK. Yeah, so that's really it for this year.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of really wonderful things in the pipeline for Bakwa books.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I think many people are saying it all sounds so good. So great. Okay, so moving on to Eric, you had just mentioned, I think you were saying the majority of the books that you acquire are from translators. But what I'm curious about is what goes into the decision process. How do you, as a team at Dedalus, decide this is a book for us?
We tend to like things which are unusual. And to be honest, with contemporary fiction, it's very unusual that a book that we want to buy, that another publisher wants to buy. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but we tend not to get competition. I'm always shocked to know that someone else wants to buy this book. You know, crazy. You know, what's wrong with them? And it is quite strange when I think of the ones that I've tried to buy and other people have bought, and some have become great successes. So obviously I did something wrong there. If one of our translators wants to translate a book, we normally always say yes, because in a way it's like small teams, a family. You know, when people have done things for us, they want to do a book, we say yes, and we do it. So we go away from anyone's personal individual taste. Quite a few books come by accident. Our most successful translation came by accident. That was a new Finnish grammar by Diego Morani. Mm-hmm. I went to a conference in Brussels of the EU, and I brought along some copies of our books and gave to the man organizing it, which was Diego Morani. He said, I'll give you a copy of one of my books. And he gave me New Finnish Grammar in Italian. And I gave it to someone to read. They said it's quite good. I read it, and I thought this book will sell 300 copies. Which a lot of our books do. Mm-hmm. And it ended up selling 30,000 copies.
Wow.
Which isn't an everyday occurrence, as most books sell 300 copies for us. And this is a book that was 10 years old, turned down by all the major UK American publishers. And we sold 30,000 copies. The interesting thing is, it had hardly been translated anywhere until we did it.
Right.
It's very unusual that a small publisher makes a book published by a large publisher in Italy an international success because of the success that we've enjoyed. And it's the wrong way around. Normally, big publishers publish a book, make it a success, and if you're lucky, a small publisher, you pick it up at the end. Whereas we reverse that process. But in the end, translators on the whole give us most of our books. We get books from agents and lots of other sources, but mainly translators. And as I said, we tend to like books which are unusual. One of our most unusual books was by an author called Vladimir Sharov, Before and During. And in an interview in The Guardian in April, the novelist David Peace was asked what he was reading, and he said Before and During by Vladimir Sharov. And he said, discovering an author like that makes life worth living. And as a publisher, that's what we want to do.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's been a whole number of comments in the chat talking about how they really just support, indie publishers not being afraid to take risks. So thank you. And thank you for trusting translators. I mean, I feel like I can speak on behalf of a number of us. Just thank you. Yeah. Moving on to Kristen. Okay. I'm sure a lot of people are curious how Pushkin acquires rights. I'm guessing it's mainly through agents, but also more so what makes it like, yes, we want this book.
Yeah, we acquire quite a lot through kind of agented submissions or submissions from international publishers. And sometimes those might come with a translator already attached to the project, or sometimes it's a case of then seeking out a translator. I also just want to say I got the name of the translator of When We Cease to Understand the World wrong earlier. It's Adrian Nathan West, who is brilliant. So we also work with international scouts. We have 2 scouts we work with who are Spanish and German language speakers, but they have a network of readers who scout lots of different international markets for us. So quite often we get recommendations of new and upcoming books through them. And we do also get recommendations from translators a fair bit, particularly translators we've worked with before, or sometimes kind of translators we haven't worked before who pitch us stuff. And then also a fair bit comes about just through our own reading and research. So on our editorial team, we have collectively French, German and Spanish language skills. And so people are reading in those languages. It's not uncommon for us to read something that's been published in one language, then translated into, for example, French, and we're able to get to it that way. That's how we pick up titles sometimes. And then we quite often are originating our own classics projects sort of ourselves, and then deciding we want to do fresh translations of the classic and then finding a translator. So an example of that might be recently, I'm working on a collection of stories by Bruno Schulz, the great classic Polish writer. And that was just a writer who's been on our radar for a while. There's a lot of love for him among the editorial team, and we decided we really wanted to do a new edition of his stories because we felt like there was a space in the market for it. And then I went out and found the translator Stanley Bill, who translates from Polish and is also an academic at Cambridge, and just connected with him, talked to him about the project, and it felt like a great fit. So then we committed to it that way. And I think for Pushkin, we always say that our publishing project is the best stories from wherever they come from in the world. And so I think we prize really good storytelling. I think we prioritize books where we feel there's a really interesting story to be told about it. So either, we might just be talking about how brilliant the quality of the writing or the narrative is, or it might be that it has a really interesting history. The Passenger is a good example of that. It's a brilliant book, but also it comes with such a kind of fascinating, important story. I think we also, kind of like everyone's been saying, we're all kind of working in a similar terrain of we do like to publish books that are a little bit more different, a bit more outside the box. Kind of, we're not so afraid necessarily of mixing genres or things that are a little bit more unusual. But then we do also publish, for example, some quite commercial crime books from all over the world, which is just really fun to demonstrate the ways in which seemingly quite commercial titles can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be an English language title. You could love a lot of contemporary British crime and then discover that you also absolutely love contemporary Swedish crime or contemporary like Japanese crime and those kind of things. Right. So yeah, it's kind of just the storytelling and the quality above all else. And then if the book has a great story that comes with it, then that's always really, really powerful for us.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I mean, we're talking about the Vertigo list with the crime fiction. It's a real favorite of mine, the Pushkin Vertigo. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, so now we're coming to the sort of meat of the conversation, which is your advice for translators, whether we're pitching to you or when we submit the manuscript or, you know, during publicity. What advice would you have for translators at any of these stages, or what is the sort of best practice that you've seen that a particular translator has done and you're like, I wish everybody would do that? So maybe let's start, I guess, with Silvina, if you can share with us anything you've come across that really made you go like, yes, please, why don't all translators do this?
Yes. So first of all, I maybe this is an obvious thing, but go through, find out about presses that have a specific focus on translation, because at least in the US, many don't. And go through their catalogs, see if they have a series with specific focus, like Latin American, Asian, whatever. Check out if they have open calls or prizes, and of course mark them in your calendars and follow them on social media, sign up for the newsletter. So first finding about them. And then the same with magazines and that have a specific sections for translations. Why? Because it is important for us, if we move now towards the cover letter, which is for us one of the most important things. I can't emphasize enough how important it is when we receive so many submissions to make, how can you make your cover letter stand out? That's very, very important. And we have to consider that many of us editors might not be familiar with the languages you're sending your proposals about, or with the authors. So anything that can help contextualize the author, and for instance, showing that you have already published excerpts in recognized magazines. So everything that builds a sort of attention and trust toward that piece is very, very important. And also I would say encourage targeted cover letters versus generic ones. Very, very important. So get to know the press you're approaching, go through their catalogs, say why it would be a good fit for that specific press. I cannot emphasize this enough again. Let me see if there's something else I have written. So anything that would make us editors hold on to something that would make us go through this, approach these authors when we do not know them. Anything that can make us hold on to that, basically.
So some context, about where the work is coming from and the author and why it's important.
And maybe how the author connects with other authors in the catalog, for instance.
That's a really good one. Yes. So kind of adding, how the star that we're pitching to you fits in your constellation.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just in terms of your personal experience, though, because you have worked with a number of translators, I mean, we don't need names unless you'd like to praise them, but what has there ever been something a translator has done that you've really just appreciated, whether it's like timely responses to emails or going above and beyond in publicity, or, what is it that stands out to you as something that you really wish more translators would do?
Well, maybe I can highlight things that I usually enjoy working with translators.
Yes.
Is openness and flexibility during the editorial process. so that it's very clear for us that we are trying to get the best book possible, and it's not about persons, because that might get in the way. No, who is right, who is not, it doesn't matter. Always redirect to the importance of the text. We are talking about a text. And then in terms of publicity, of course, if they can support a book in any way, like doing readings, help publicize by sharing on social media, everything helps, especially in poetry.
Especially in poetry. Yeah, thank you. No, that's a really good reminder, because I myself, you can take it so personally as a translator when either being edited or just, otherwise, but just to remember, the publisher obviously wants the text to be the best it can be as well. And it's a collaboration. It's not an us versus you scenario. Thank you so much. Yeah. Nafor, do you want to share with us maybe some wonderful things translators have done, or perhaps maybe where you've seen some gaps, maybe where you've seen something where you wish they would have done this? Yeah.
No, I don't think I've seen gaps per se, but I think it was earlier as Lopez, if I get the name right, Mrs. Lopez, said, basically I can sum it down to research. Like, do your research on the publisher before pitching. Check out the catalog, check out what they publish, check out how the work, like you said, the work you do fit in with what they are doing before you submit to them. So it's basically that, do your research on the publisher before even pitching. That way you know where you're going to, and you know the likelihood of them being interested in the work you're submitting. Now in the editing process, of course, it's a conversation generally in editing, like I said. And there's one thing I liked with the book with Emile Boom's Translator and Chanji, is that initially I was afraid, because this is the first book that's been translated from Cameroon, like basically from Cameroon going international. And we were very, very keen on like going into the details, and I was afraid, like, okay, maybe he will take this badly, like he won't be, but he was very understanding. So this is something that I really encourage, being able to understand that it's not about you, it's not about, it's not personal, actually. We're trying to get the best out of the book. And you collaborating and you understanding that it's a conversation, and it's not an imposition either. We suggest and we don't impose. If you find that it's interesting and going to improve the quality of the work you've submitted, great. But generally, we've worked with a very, very interesting people, and very, how can I say, very patient translators. And I must say, most of the people we've worked with are actually budding literary translators. So they actually understand that it's a two-way process. We help you and you help us to get the book to the best level it can be. Yeah, and when it comes to the publicity, obviously helping in any way you can, being available for, if there is stuff I can meet and greet with people from the industry or with potential readers. If you can be available for events, then that's a plus. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, yes, and also please, before I forget, there's one thing, once your manuscript is accepted, always check on the editorial policy when it comes to, for example, use of punctuations, use of grammatical rules, for example. It helps in the editing process. So you know exactly where, for example, a full stop goes either within the quote or outside the quotes. So yeah.
So house style is
exactly.
Yeah, is really important. Yeah, that's a good reminder to myself. Kirsten, could you tell us a bit, because I think you're like one of the bigger houses here. What are your expectations as a house in terms of when it comes to publicity? How much, because I think there's obviously, as translators, we want the book to do well. And a lot of the time we do things for free, but are there any instances where, translators are being paid to do some publicity, or where do you draw the line, or how does it work?
It's really interesting, the question of kind of translators and publicity, because I think maybe this is a feature of British publishing, and I'm not saying that this is a good thing at all, is that it tends to be very author-led. Yeah, I think partially maybe because British publishing in the round, excluding the brilliant people here, isn't so kind of receptive or interested in the work of translation. external sort of teams, external audiences are quite often most focused on the author. And I think authors as well tend to get asked to do a lot of unpaid labour when it comes to promoting their books. And something that we always try and be mindful of with both our authors and our translators is not being over demanding, and also not asking them to do any work where there isn't, you know, like a tangible payoff, not asking them to do unnecessary work. So for example, we don't like to ask authors to just like create loads of content for us that we may or may not use. Sometimes we want authors or translators, if they might write a piece for somewhere, and if it's, you know, like a newspaper or an online blog, normally those typically are paid, and we try and make sure the payment is secured.
Okay.
We would want that to, you know, be secured before we ask the author or the translator to do that kind of labour. Something that can really be helpful for us is, particularly if we're working with an author where they're not so confident or comfortable using English, translators who are able to help us mediate with the author, potentially, you know, if they write authored content, translating that content, which I'd say would typically be paid. And just little things like that, like helping the communication between the author, can be really, really valuable to us. But I think we don't have huge publicity expectations for our translators. And I also think we wouldn't, you know, it can be so burdensome and so tiring, the work around promoting a book, that you don't really want to create labour that's unnecessary or create kind of tiresome work where, you know, there isn't a tangible reward for that. Some other things I might say just on kind of like best practices in terms of pitching and stuff. I'd be really interested to hear what other people on the panel think about this, but the shared feeling on our editorial team is we really massively prefer if we get a sample as part of our pitch. We hugely prefer just like one continuous sample. None of us as editors really like samples that take lots of little sections from the book. It's interesting. We all kind of just feel like maybe it's just, I don't know, a Pushkin brain thing. None of us enjoy that as a reading experience. We find it a lot easier to just have one continuous piece of text to get, because I think with the sample, we're often much more interested in getting a flavour of the writing, and we look to something like a synopsis to get a sense of the overall novel. But I'd be really interested to hear if other people on the panel feel the same or if they feel differently.
Yeah. Thank you. Eric, could you perhaps pick that one up? What's your view in terms of receiving a sample either like in one continuous chunk, or are you open to having a sample like with different excerpts from the book?
I don't mind, but for me, normally before the sample is the covering letter. If the covering letter can't make the book seem interesting, why read the sample?
Yeah, exactly, right.
It really is fundamental. If you're going to write to somebody, you have to show enthusiasm. You have to make it seem interesting. I mean, the projects we've done tend to come with a good pitch, a good covering letter. I say to authors, if you can't make yourself seem interesting, why should anyone publish you? Because you're in the business of fiction, of creating things. As a translator, you need to show enthusiasm. You need to show why this author is so interesting that the publisher basically should lose his or her money publishing this author. So the projects we've done tend to go with a very good covering letter, a good sample. Normally, if we take a book which has been sent to us to a translator, we will, as long as the sample is good enough, we will always give it to the translator. Most of the translators we have taken from outside have started off by sending us something with a sample. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, Mike Mitchell sent us a sample and asked us to publish a novel by Rosendorff, The Architect of Ruins. We were actually looking for a translator for Gustav Meyrink, and we said, no, we don't want to do this book, but would you like to translate Gustav Meyrink? He said, yes, we did that. And then we went back and published the novel by Herbert Rosendorff. And quite a lot of our translators have come this path. So a good covering letter, make your author seem interesting. Obviously, the basic is you have to understand your publisher. The problem, if you look at a big publishers list, you think, oh, I'll send it to them because they publish A, B, and C. But they probably publish A, B, and C because A, B, and C make them money.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a commercial publisher, you have higher expectations in terms of sales, because if you take too many low-selling authors, you're out of a job.
Right.
So there's a difference. When you do it to an independent publisher, and especially small independent publishers, basically a lot of their books do not sell lots of copies. So one of the big criterion isn't how many copies is this book going to sell. It's, does this book fit our list? Do we like it? Do we want to go behind it? But if you go to a big publisher, they're there to make a living and they have to sell books that sell more copies. So know your publisher, pitch basically commercial things to bigger publishers. You can pitch more off-the-wall stuff to smaller publishers. And again, each of our lists here has a certain style, a certain feel, and you have to get that. And some people's submissions are so good because they understand the list. What I say about our list, it is so easy to know what fits our list that most of our readers, most of our translators know far better than I do what fits our list. So this is what you do as a translator. You show your passion, you show your quality, and basically you turn no into yes, because no is always the right answer. So there has to be something that turns no into yes.
I love that. That's going to be my new tagline, turn no into yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we are racking up some really good questions from the audience. And so before we move to the audience questions, my sort of final question to you is, I'm curious what sort of, like, you know, aside from financial, right? Because we know that everybody is suffering from a sort of financial hit. What are the other challenges you face as a house? And yeah, and then maybe we can talk about possible solutions, but we have a few minutes before we go to the larger Q&A. So Nuford, can we start with you? Are there any particular challenges at the moment for Bakwa?
Yes, actually, Bakwa being a small publisher, indie publisher in Cameroon, it's our challenges are the same as they've always been. So our main challenge mainly is infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So being on the continent, I guess we get to work 4 times as hard to get our books out there and to get them available, much more than an established publisher in the West would. For example, distribution is a whole issue. Shipping is a big one. If I can tell you, sometimes it may actually be easier to ship to Europe than to ship within Africa.
I believe it.
So, and
it's crazy, but I believe it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And you have sometimes, like, you have Nigeria is just next door to Cameroon, right? We're neighbors. You want to ship something from Nigeria, for example, a book from Nigeria, depending on the volume, the quantity, and maybe the publisher or the agent or the distributor, it has to go transit through France before coming back to Cameroon, which is kind of crazy. Which is crazy. So yeah, there's a lot of infrastructural issues we have. That's the physical infrastructure. In terms of digital infrastructure, payment infrastructure, none of that is tailored to meet our needs, actually. So we have a difficult time handling. You have to find ways of working around all of that. And of course, like the French say, le nerf de la guerre, the money, the financials, is always, it's a tough time getting to get the money to print everything we would like to print. So we always have to be very picky about the titles we choose to publish. So that's basically it.
Yeah. Does Bakwa do ebooks, or do you have any plans of doing ebooks?
Yes, we're still trying to find a way to work around it. So we started by trying with a Nigerian platform, Okada Books, which doesn't seem very conducive because it's mainly targeted to the Nigerian audience.
Okay.
Cameroonians. We're trying to target Cameroon and Africa, so it's kind of difficult. So for now, we are trying to work with Amazon. Unfortunately, as much as we hate it, to make the books available, some of our titles available, we've had to partner with. We have the African Books Collective too, with whom we partner to get our books out there. But ebooks are not, for now, something we can confidently involved in. But it's in the works. We're planning on finding a way of making these books available around the world in ebook.
Yeah, well, maybe if somebody even in the audience here would have some suggestions of a good ebook platform, which I'm sure you've exhausted all your options, but definitely I would say contact Info and maybe suggest something, because I know we would love to read more Bakwa books.
Yeah, it'd be great. And unfortunately, like I said, the problem is not just digital platforms. They are available. Some of them are available. The other issue is payments, for example. In Cameroon, and probably one out of 20 people has a Visa card, for example. So most of the solutions out there are tailored for people in the West who have easy access to digital and e-money. Here, most available, the most how can I say, the ubiquitous solution is mobile money, and there are no platforms that are tailored for you to use mobile money to pay for books, for example. Whereas our primary audience is Cameroonian and African. We don't have solutions to target and address that audience's needs for our books. So that's our main challenge when it comes to digital literature.
Okay. Well, I know some people working in the mobile money industry. I will bring this to their table. Yeah. Okay, Kirsten, I'm curious about what challenges does Pushkin face? Because to me, on the face of it, things are pretty rosy.
It's true, we've been having a very good few years, which we feel incredibly privileged as well, off the back of, the ongoing pandemic. But I think UK publishing all kind of collectively was like, when it started. I've got a sort of a negative answer and then a positive spin. I think all of UK publishing, printing at the moment is really challenging. Paper supplies are not in a good place. It's become a lot more kind of just logistically complicated. Causes a lot of real headaches for our kind of brilliant production team, who have to work really hard to make sure that we can kind of still hit our schedules and that we can still print books, and also prices for paper are going up a lot and that kind of thing. My positive spin on this would be that I think in the last kind of decade or so, the feeling on our editorial team is that we've gone from quite often being, the only publisher who wants to buy a certain book to actually having to compete with other publishers to buy the books, because I think slowly, translation is starting to become a bit more mainstream in UK publishing. And so now we're actually, it's sometimes harder to get hold of the books that we want because other publishers are going for them, which is annoying for us, but probably good for the publishing scene as a whole.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's I love hearing that. Okay, so in the past just few minutes, the questions have skyrocketed in the Q&A section. So we're going to just jump to that. As I mentioned earlier, the audience has the capability of, prioritizing certain questions that they want asked. And so at the top of the list, we have, can the publishers answer if they offer royalties or for translators? And that's by Lawrence Schimmel. So Eric, could we start with you, please? So if you offer royalties.
We offer sort of standard terms of the Translators Association. Ironically, we changed to them even though they weren't as good as what we offered before, because we were pressurized to have their terms. So we went from better terms to less better terms, but they were the terms of the Translators Association. So that's progress.
Okay. So you do offer royalties then?
Yes, we offer but the problem comes that the basic fee of the translator is seen as the advance. So if the translator earns £9,000 for a translation, it takes an awful lot of sales to earn out before you start earning royalties, because the majority of the royalty goes to the author, and in our contract, I think it's 1 going on to 2% goes to translator. But the translator normally earns more money than the author does to begin with, so they rarely get to earn royalties. I know very few translators who earn substantial money from royalties, because basically after £8,000-9,000 fee, you're not going to get many royalties unless you're publishing commercial fiction, translating commercial fiction.
Right. Or unless you're getting royalties, I guess, from the first book sold, which I do know some publishers do.
Yeah.
Right. Silvina, could you share with us your if you give translators royalties?
Yes, we do, and we have to consider that Duckling Presse is a non-profit with limited resources, but we do give royalties to translators. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Nafor?
Yes, we're in the same situation. We give royalties to the translators.
Okay.
We do.
You do.
May not be as high as we would like to, but yeah, we do give royalties to translators.
Okay. And Kirsten?
Yeah, Pushkin also give royalties to translators as standard.
Great. Is it from first copy, or is it after a certain number of copies?
I mean, it's slightly different for every kind of translation deal we do. I think more typically we pay in advance, but not always.
Okay, so it is like sort of case by case basis.
Yeah, generally, but as standard, we always offer royalties in some form for sure.
For sure. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, okay, the next question is that sometimes literary translators don't know many authors personally, and yet they're still looking forward to getting for work. This is from Anna. And she's saying, in these circumstances, is it appropriate to simply approach a publisher with your sort of past experience and ask whether they have any available titles? So in a more condensed way, would you be open to translators coming to you if they don't have a book in hand that they'd want to pitch? But they have, experience, but they just don't have a specific project, and that perhaps you have some titles. I'm not sure.
You have to be very lucky to find a publisher who's specifically looking for a translator from a certain language, unless it's a minority language. I mean, normally any project we have from French, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, there's no shortage of translators. If you're approaching publishers, you really need to go with an author or suggestions, because in a way that's your job. You're giving them something they haven't got. They've got translators who they use. So all of our new translators have arrived with a book, and that's how they become a translator for us. Then obviously they get to translate books that they haven't suggested because they're in the fold, shall we say. But to begin with, that's how you find your publisher, or publishers, plural.
Thank you.
Pushkin, similarly, we do, if translators approach us just kind of to generally present themselves, we do share that information among the editors, and we have sort of, a database where we do keep a record of that. But I'd completely echo Eric that I think you have a much tougher hit rate if you're not coming with a specific project.
Yeah, I suspected as much. So thank you for answering that. We have our next question is from Rosalind, and they're asking, Kirsten, as per your point about continuous samples, do the panel think it's worth sending an initial email to ask what sort of sample the house prefers, whether it's before producing a sample as part of the pitch? They've heard differing preferences around this in terms of giving a sense of the book's style, etc. Maybe, I know an editor who doesn't like having it from the beginning of the book, because this is me saying, as in the editor says that it doesn't give them a real taste of the book and they would rather it from the middle of the book. So question is, do you think it's worth translators just initially reaching out and asking what sort of sample each of you would like, or you don't think that's necessary? Sylvina, maybe you could.
Well, in our case, maybe fiction, I think it probably is a bit different. In our case, it's mostly poetry, so it's more autonomous things. But I take this opportunity to emphasize how important is a sample, of course, but what you choose to show first, because as Eric said before, first comes the cover letter, but then if you have so many submissions, it has to be really, really strong what you show, because otherwise who is reading will pass over.
Yes. Yeah.
I think you have to do the beginning, because when you read a book, you start at the beginning. Basically, the function of of a translation, any sample, page 1, sentence 1 brings you to sentence 2. Sentence 3 brings you to sentence 4. Page 1 brings you to page 2. I've read lots of things. 1 sentence, that's it. 2 sentences, that's it. 1 page, that's it. So you start at the beginning, because the reader starts at the beginning. And if the beginning isn't good enough, you've got no interest in the book. So you really need to start at the beginning. Start in the middle. Most readers don't get to the middle. So the sample has to be at the beginning. And in the end, whatever the sample is, it shows the quality of the translation. A good translation stands out. I mean, we recently made an application for a Spanish book called My Father's House, translated by Margaret Yule Costa and Sophie Hughes. And in our pitch to the Arts Council, we actually said, this translation is as good as you're ever going to get. This is why you should fund the book. So, that might not be true, but in my judgment, that's true. In the end, it's enthusiasm, and you start at the beginning, because, as I said, you might never get to page 4.
Right. So on the, okay, I'm going to speed up the questions just because there's a lot more we're trying to get through. Quickly, if each of you could just tell me the ideal length for a sample, in terms of word count. Is it 3,000, 4,000, 5,000? For Sylvina, about how many poems are you looking at? Let's start with Nafor and then make our way just around the panel, please.
So generally we prefer a sample of 4 to 5, between 4 and 5,000. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. 4 to 5,000. Kirsten.
Yeah, I think somewhere between like 3,000 and 5,000 words, if it's part of a pitch, as opposed to like you've been asked to do a sample translation to see if you're the right translator for it, because then it's probably going to be shorter.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sylvina, how many poems are you hoping?
So it will be around from 10 to 20 pages, and always try to include the original language.
Okay.
And I cannot emphasize again, follow the guidelines. Whatever they are asking, follow step by step.
Yes.
It helps to the editors. Yeah.
Yeah, whether it's double spaced or, 12-point font, something like that. And Eric, how long of a sample are you looking for?
I think it varies. Penn asks for 1,500 words to 2,000. But for me, I would have thought, depending on the book, 4 or 5 pages maximum, say 10 pages. Because what we do, if we like the first sort of sample, then we ask for a larger sample, then we ask for a bit more, then we ask for the whole book. But I would say minimum is 1,500 words. I think looking at it from the translator's point of view, you don't want to do a very long translated sample of something you're not going to be paid for.
Exactly. Yes, you read my mind.
1,500 to sort of 3,000. I mean, everyone knows that. I mean, occasionally some people have actually translated the whole book.
Wow, as the sample.
No, it happens quite often. People have translated the whole book, and they spend forever trying to get people to take the whole book. But that's life. But 1,500 to 3,000 words.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question from Rahma. They're saying, how important is the experience of a translator, especially previously published work or a degree in translation, relative to, like, compared to the cover letter and sample when you're deciding to work with a translator? So, because we have a number of emerging translators here in the school and attending our talk today, obviously they're wondering, like, how important is it to have a degree, or what are you looking for when you're choosing a translator, I guess, basically. Yeah. Let's start with Kirsten. Yeah.
I think we're looking for just, any way you can demonstrate your expertise and engagement with the language that you're translating from. So that obviously doesn't have to be a degree in translation. Maybe you're like a native speaker, or maybe you've studied it for a very long time, but just that is a requirement. Yeah. I think, and then also actually we work with translators, I think, at all different stages of their careers. We worked with lots of translators for whom this is an early translation, and we work with very well established translators. I think it's all just about showing like your enthusiasm and your kind of the quality that you can deliver something of quality, and then the experience is less important.
That's heartening to hear. Okay, Nafor, what is Bakwa Books looking for in a translator?
So I'd say Bakwa Books' situation is kind of special. So we don't just work with translators, we also try to nurture translators. So we have tried to, we've had workshops with in partnership with University of Bristol, for example, and with known industry like Ross Schwartz. And we've tried to like nurture a new breed of translators for what we believe. We believe there's a lot to be done in terms of translation locally. So we've tried to like create a pool of people that we've worked with before. So it's not necessarily how much experience they have in translation, but how well the work they've done speaks for them. So it's not about the degree. It's about how well the work is do. How good is it? How good, in fact, is it interesting when we read? Is it, yeah, so that's basically, it's not about degrees in any case.
Great, thank you. And Silvina?
I agree with what's been said. It's more about the quality of the work and that they show us than the degree. And also Ugly Duckling Press also is a special case because it's compelling to us if it's an emerging translator versus someone who has already a huge record of publication. We even have in some open calls that as a requisite, as a request, like either the translator or the author maybe not having published before a full length, for instance, in some of the calls.
Thank you. And Eric, would you like to add anything onto what has been said?
I think what matters is how interesting the book seems and how good is the sample translation. Today, most people have been to university. That means nothing. It's how interesting is the project and how good the translation is. Also, enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is better than any mountain of qualifications or experience. And we're always looking for someone new, because in the end, the only way you survive as a publisher is embracing new and new ideas, new people. So there's always a market for new people with quality, imagination, and energy and enthusiasm.
Wonderful, thank you. So for all of you listening today, it seems, very much that you just need to make sure that your translation is stellar, and the rest doesn't really matter as long as you've got the right sort of enthusiasm for the project. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. Moving on to the next question, which is, this is by Nuzhat, and their question is, could the editors speak a bit more about the process of editing translations? What challenges, debates, or politics do you grapple with, or have you grappled with recently when editing? And maybe if we can start with Nfor.
Second. Okay, so if I get the question right, the editing process of translations and what politics do we grapple with. So the process at Bakwa, it's kind of the two-way thing. So I guess it's more of a conversation, depending on the type of work that needs to be done. It's more of a conversation between the editor and the translator. And it also depends on who is editing the work.
Mm-hmm.
If I am editing the work, for example, I tend to be a bit more nitpicky because I'm a translator, first of all, and it sometimes it's a problem because you have to make sure that you don't become a second translator. You have to make sure you stay out of it, and you're trying to get the translator to give the best of themselves instead of trying to produce your own translation of what you think he should have done. Yeah, so that's it. So that's that, and generally it comes around to politics. At Bakwa, for example, we have a strict policy of not italicizing words that are not in English. We don't italicize words that are not in English. So if it's a Creole, if it's a Pidgin, if it's a broad word, it stays unitalicized because we believe it's a political decision. Whenever you choose to italicize, you're othering the other language, like this is not standard, this is not up to what English, yeah. So when we publish our books, be it a local Pidgin, be it a local language, we don't italicize. And it's generally something that comes back always. People have been taught to italicize words that are not in English, and we're trying to like help them unlearn that. Yeah, so it's generally one of the things we get to battle and grapple with.
Just to share, yeah, all of the enthusiasm from the audience. I must applaud you. We have a lot of woohoos and yes and hearts to not italicizing. So yes, yeah, I know it's a lot of love for Bakwa books. So much so I've forgotten what our question was. Right. Okay, politics in the politics of editing. Okay, moving on to Silvina. Could you share with us maybe some of the politics when editing poetry? Or any issues that you grapple with when editing poetry?
So mainly I focus on, this is my personal case, I focus on books that are translated from the Spanish, and I speak both languages. So, and we usually in Ugly Duckling have 2 editors for each book. So we have 2 different views plus the translator, right? So it's a quite deep process. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm saying something very basic, but I try to do a close reading of the poetry in Spanish, and then check that the English somehow echoes what the poem is doing in the Spanish, and also consider cultural references that might be skipped by the translator if they are not familiar with the context of a book.
Right. Thank you. Kirsten, would you like to share any sort of, as of late, editing?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I am a lot earlier in my career as an editor than everyone else on the panel, but I would say from my personal experience, every book is such a different kind of process working with the translator, but I think I very much see my role as being there to just kind of help polish the text as much as possible. And so when I'm editing, I'm looking for kind of any moments that just don't quite read clearly to me, or things that just don't feel quite right, and just trying to question and tease out any kind of irregularities or little moments that could be refined even more within the text. And recently a translator I worked with, when they delivered the manuscript, they said to me, like, please, like, kind of almost stress test this as much as possible, please. I'm really keen for you to like question as much as possible, and then I can come back to you and say, like, no, this word is here for a particular reason, or there's a particular context behind this. But I think if like the relationship between the editor and the translator is really strong and you're able to do that, that's really fantastic, because then you kind of get to stress test different parts of the text and make sure that everything is just working as strongly as it possibly can together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Eric, I'm going to ask you one of our next questions, just so we can try to get to everybody's question. One of our next question is, what are your views on translators writing readers' reports, like offering to write readers' reports for titles you may be considering?
You know, that tends to be what sort of large publishers use and stuff like that. In the end, we're interested in sort of projects, and we don't tend to use readers' reports externally because we have very large linguistic expertise. We cover most European languages and Arabic and various other languages and things. And so that might be a way in for some people, but I think the better way in is to do your sample.
Is to do your sample.
Because in the end, I mean, going back to editing briefly, when I edit a book, I only look at the original if there's something wrong in the text. It's a bit odd because I see it, we're in literary fiction is the entertainment industry. So it's about how good is the English, how good is the English in telling the story. If that means it's further away from the original, for me, that doesn't matter. To have a text which is so close to the original, but the language is not good enough, or it's stilted or whatever, it doesn't work. We are not academics, we're in the entertainment industry. So for me, editing is about the quality of the translator's English and anything you can do to help the translator. And it doesn't matter, to be honest, if it's not the most accurate translation. People are like D.H. Lawrence, he's a great translator, but he made so many mistakes. But the books read well. And in the end, that's what you want, a book that reads well. And because not everyone knows all the cultural references, and there are lots of things like that that, you know, sort of in the perfect world gets picked up. But in the imperfect world, it's the quality of the English. And if the English is good enough, nearly everything else doesn't matter.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Nfor, there's a question specifically for you from Al-Arif Khalid, and they're saying, has Bakwa ever considered publishing or received a submission of anything translated from Arabic, from North Africa into English? Are you planning on branching out into other languages on the continent?
So no, we haven't received any pitch from the north yet. And in truth, right now, like I said earlier, we are more of a niche. So we plan to branch out in the future, but right now we're focusing mostly on Cameroon, Central Africa, and West Africa. Yes, but we plan to branch out in the future. In any case, I guess if we receive an interesting pitch, we won't turn it down. So.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. And okay, we also have a question from Georgie Fuchs, and they're asking about short stories. I mean, short stories have a notorious reputation of being unsellable and really bad for, you know, publishers in general don't like short stories. What are your views on short story collections? Kirsten?
I mean, these are only my personal. Yeah, people really get it in their heads that short stories are tough, and you hear that a lot, that it's like it's really tough to sell short stories, and like maybe that's true depending on your readership, depending, you know, what kind of context you're publishing into. Maybe it's something we've all just hyped up to ourselves so much that we now will just believe it. I think, yeah, though it is, I think across UK publishing, if you're a translator, unfortunately, it is quite typical to expect that the bar is really, really high. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think that it would be great if we were able to publish more short stories, and I'm not quite sure who, you know, where the fault really lies in terms of where this idea that short stories are tough has truly come from. If it's really true that, for example, UK readers, the only readership that I really engage with, don't like short stories, or if we're all kind of a bit too scared of short stories, I'm not sure.
Right. Thank you. And okay, I recognize it's 2:45 now, but I'm just going to ask our organizers do we have time for like one more question, or do we need to end it here? Yes. Okay. All caps. Yes. Okay. We can do one more question. Great. And there's so much great like chat happening on the side. I'm trying to keep up with it all. I wish we could go on for much longer. Oh my goodness. Okay. Let's see what the question, next one we have. Okay. If so, what types or names do you recommend translators pitch excerpts to? Okay. This question is by Josephine Rose. And they're asking, they say that Sylvina mentioned getting excerpts of our translation published in magazines prior to approaching publishers. What types or names of magazines would you recommend translators pitch excerpts to? And this is, I guess we can start with you, Sylvina, and then branch out to the panel if that's something that they also look for. Because you speak about establishing trust around the piece, and that there's already been sort of attention and eyes on it, which is something I always tell my mentees as well, that you need to build buzz for the work before you pitch it. So are there any particular magazines specifically for poetry that when you see like, oh yeah, that they've had their, poetry in there, this is something we should consider?
Yeah, I would definitely approach magazines that have translation sections, because that it's a math question. You will be competing with less people, and also it will probably be read by translations editor who are people interested in translation. So you are not competing with the general submissions. So it makes it a bit easier. So there are many in the US that have translation sections.
Right. Are there any one or two titles that come to mind, like some of your, more preferred ones that you like to read? Or
for instance, Brooklyn Rail, Tupelo Quarterly, the Los Angeles Review, Asymptote, Two Lines, Walkswing, all those are magazines that have translation sections.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. And Eric, how important is that to you? That the book?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
Not at all. The only thing I would say on short stories, we've actually started a short story series called Take Six.
Take Six.
We have 6 women authors from a country. So we've done Portugal, which is the most successful, Spain. We've got coming 6 authors from the Balkan. We've got Catalan, and we got Latvia. And to answer your question, do they sell well? The answer is no, apart from the Portuguese one.
Okay, that's okay. But I love hearing these country-specific short story or short form focus.
6 women authors together in the collection.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, and that this focus on women translators. Oh my goodness. And women authors. Yes, would love to know when that moves to Asia and,
Africa.
Okay, so maybe a sort of collaboration with Bakwa Books is in the works. Yeah.
Cameroon,
Yeah, could be Cameroon. I'm telling you, Nafor smiling. This is it. We're on to something.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to have to stop it here just because I feel like we could keep going on. I want to thank everybody who, well, first of all, our panelists, thank you for being so generous with your answers and your time. And to the British Centre for Literary Translation for giving us the space to have this conversation in the first place. Thank you to everyone who has come in the audience and all of your wonderful, just comments on the side and invigorating questions. I myself, feel I've just really learned so much from this talk, and I just encourage each of you in the audience to, follow these publishers on Twitter, Facebook, wherever they are, contact them, make the connections, and just, really pitch your works to them. And I look forward to hearing about future collaborations. And that's it. And have a lovely afternoon, evening. And thank you. Bye. Masalama.
Thank you for hosting, Sawad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.